Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor, and back with me today is Jeff, the Supreme Pontiff himself. How you doing?
I'm doing really well. How are you doing?
Good. Today we are going to put Dead Poets Society and the Emperor's Club head to head to determine which one I guess we prefer, why we prefer the other one, or one other versus the other. And just sort of generally talking about, where either succeeds, where the other one fails. And also we'll talk about sort of, which one is, if you've listened to our previous episodes, you'll kind of already know which one is the more moral of the two. Um, but they, but yeah, so we'll discuss that as well. So, Jeff, what do you think about the two films? Comparing the two.
Yeah, I think that it's actually really an interesting kind of comparison where they almost match up with their subject matters. Where in that Professor Keating teaches English, so literature. Dead Poet Society is a more like not artistic, but like interesting cinematography than Dead Poet Society. It
You
has
mean
times where it's
then
more,
Emperor's Club? You mean?
or sorry, than Emperor's Club, yeah. um, and yeah, so Dead Poet Society is a little bit more like emotional. It gets you going, whereas Professor or Mr. Hundert in the Emperor's Club teaches classics. So it's not as artsy of a movie. There's less about like hard hitting emotional scenes so much as like it's really trying to teach lessons. So I think even just the subject matters for each of the different classrooms kind of typifies what you're going to get from them. So in Dead Poets Society, I do think it's more emotionally compelling at times. I remember watching it in high school, as most of us did, getting that, drive to carpe diem, seize the day, suck the marrow out of life. And like there was good that I thought I was finding in that movie, but it was very shallow. Whereas Dead Poet or the Emperor's Club ultimately is a much more sound, foundation to build upon. He's the teacher there, Mr. Hundert, is trying to build young men properly and giving them good guidance instead of just letting them loose. And I think a good way to actually showcase the differences between the two films is there are a couple of scenes that actually really kind of match and mirror each other from the different films, and it shows the difference there. So in Dead Poet Society, one of the, if not the first scenes was the opening address from the dean to the students in the chapel. And you got the sense right away that this was a very rigid, very hardcore school. Everyone had to stand up and recite things, and it was more about rote memorization than anything else. And the difference then when you get to the Emperor's Club is you do still have the professor or the dean getting up and addressing the student body, but he's actually trying to like, set the stage for what they are learning. And he, rather than having, the just four pillars that they mention in the Dead Poets Society that then get mocked later, excellence being changed to excrement and whatnot. The motto that they use isn't just about memorizing something, it's the end is in or can be found in the beginning, saying that how you build yourself morally, especially as a child growing into a young man, how you define yourself in the beginning is going to ultimately be your fate. And that I think is just in that scene alone, I think there was just a big difference, because it actually was it's not about the rigidity of the school and, making people do things, kind of setting up the chains that have to be broken. Instead, it's about inspiring them and saying what you are doing actually does matter, and we want to help set you up for a good life.
Yeah, I think a good way of looking at it also is that Keating is working under the impression that his students are basically a blank slate, and Hundert is working under the impression that he has to mold them against their worst nature, their the evil within them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's because he has an understanding of virtues. And even though neither movie is explicitly Christian in any way, he at least does seem to understand original sin and the tendency to evil that needs to be restricted.
Yeah, and you brought up in the beginning, you said that, Keating is an English teacher while Hundert is a classics professor or teacher. And I was listening to a professor recently, and he was talking about how basically the leftist control of colleges started out of the English departments in many cases, because they were the largest departments, generally speaking, so they could sort of spread their influence faster. And the other departments, such as history, were more resistant at first to sort of the nonsense that was coming out of places like the English department.
Yeah, I think that absolutely makes sense. And you can even, because of the areas that they're teaching, you can see the differences in, who they're studying. On one side, you're studying Cicero and Julius Caesar, Augustus, truly great minds, great intellects. Even if they didn't always arrive at the correct conclusion, they were intellectual giants. On the other hand, you just have, and it's not that you can't find good in English. There's great literature out there, but the ones that he is really focused on is the poets, and particularly the Romantics with Thoreau and Longfellow. And those aren't really the type of people that should be held up as almost idols for the students to try to imitate. It's much better to go back in history and deal with some truly great men rather than people who wrote some stuff but did very little in their life.
Like the Romantics were generally focused on basically pleasure, more or less. They were fulfilling themselves with themselves, with nature, kind of thing. Nothing else they were really focused on. While many of the ancient or antiquity philosophers and stuff, or important leaders, were generally more focused on virtue. And as you said, they don't always come to the right conclusion. They don't always do the right thing, but they're at least holding themselves to a standard, or trying to figure out where the standard is that they should be shooting for.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this actually really ties well into the next scene that I think is really interesting as a mirror for each other. In Dead Poets Society, Keating takes his class down to look at photos of classes that have come and gone a long time ago from the same school. And the entire time he's focused on essentially two things that he's trying to get across as his point. The first is that the people that are in that photo are long gone, they're dead, they're worm food, and everyone here is going to die. So that's the first thing. And the second is, so what do you do? Seize the day, suck the marrow out of life. Right? He's focused only on the fact that people before have died, not on any of their, not even accomplishments, but even their contributions to society. Instead, it's they're dead, you're going to die, so enjoy it while you can. And on the other hand, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go.
Yeah. On the other hand, in the Emperor's Club, Professor Hundert takes his class and shows them a statue of Julius Caesar with all of the winners of the Mr. Julius Caesar contest on the wall behind them. And it's not in any way about the fact that, they're gone, they're going to die, you're going to die. Instead, it's about inspiring them to greatness. It's calling them forth and saying, this is something that you can strive for. And there's good here. And you can see all the men before you that have done that. And you even have one of the students whose father was one of the Mr. Julius Caesar winners. So there's a real emphasis on, inspiration. And again, not just look at these people, they're dead. It's look at this man who accomplished so much in Rome, and all of these men that were inspired and ascended to at least some form of greatness within this school with the amount of knowledge that they were able to not only retain, but also learn from. So I just thought that was another really interesting, foil between the two.
Yeah, achievements don't really matter much in Dead Poet Society. They're all getting really good grades. I mean, their focus at the beginning is very much like getting good grades, doing well, learning. That's basically what all the students are trying to assist each other in accomplishing such things. But that is kind of ripped away from them by this mentality of seizing the day, which as a student, I can't. I'm confused about what the purpose of what they're doing there is, if not seizing the day for their education, seizing the day for growing their intellect and becoming better people. But that's not what Keating is pushing them to do.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a way that you can interpret Carpe Diem the right way, which is what John Wooden said: make every day your masterpiece. Don't just let it slip by. And that's one way. The other is the Keating way of just seek after whatever pleasure you can find. And that actually also ties then well into the next scene that I think was a good foil. And that's the first lesson that each of the professors gives to their students. In Dead Poet Society, you have Keating telling them to rip the pages out from the introduction, because you shouldn't, actually try to analyze poetry in any way. You should just enjoy it, suck it up. And it's, again, just very much individualistic. Poetry is good for the feelings that you get from it, essentially. Whereas the first lesson in in the Emperor's Club is the student going to the back of the room and reading the plaque of Shutruk Nahunte, and the lesson being that conquest without contribution is meaningless. So it's not just about achievements either. It's about actually contributing to society, contributing to the civic good. There's just so much more depth in that lesson than don't listen to this stodgy old person because I don't like what he thinks about poetry.
Well, it's a kind of a shame these days, because I think the right response to a lot of textbooks these days would actually be to rip them up. The problem was that Dead Poet Society takes place in the 1950s. So, and I'm pretty sure that in those types of schools in the 50s, I don't think you'd need to be ripping them up.
Mm-hmm.
And just the sort of come back to sort of the hyper fixation on the what is it, on the Romantics.
Yep.
By like, this is a period between about the 1700s through the 1800s, and maybe it's actually just the 1800s. It might have just been the 1800s. I'm giving some leeway, but more or less they're taking the intellectual knowledge of a mere 100 to 150 years or so, depending on where they stop and where they start, and only consuming that type of information into their brain. And while the classics, with the classics, they're basically going for many decades. Like, the classics generally don't just hyperfixate on one person, one time period. The point of the classics is that you want to learn the basics in order for you to learn everything going forward. Because if you know what happened with ancient Rome, ancient Greece, you then have the building blocks to learn about not just those times, but also, medieval and Enlightenment and Renaissance, and then the Romantic period, like that sort of thing. You have the building blocks to expand. But if you're just focusing on the Romantics, you're not actually you're not seizing the day, in the way, in the sense of seizing a real understanding of it, of like knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this next part, I didn't so much have like direct particular scenes as foils, but what I wanted to discuss is the relationship that Hundert had with his students versus Keating with his, because it really seems to me in the Dead Poets Society, and we've discussed this before, but Keating kind of just revs up the students and then just lets them go. He doesn't get as much like really personal one-on-one time with students. He has one time that he speaks to forget the main kid who ends up shooting himself, but he has like one time with him talking one-on-one about his father. But by and large, it's him, talking to a group, just telling them about things and then letting them go. And right after that, we see them looking like druids running off into the night to go reestablish the Dead Poets Society. Whereas Hundert, on the other hand, takes a personal approach, especially with his most troublesome student, but it's not in any way it's a much more virtuous, proper mentorship, where he first just has to work on breaking down the walls. And then once he does break down the walls and actually sees that there's a moment of vulnerability, he doesn't just send him off to, seize the day. He gives him his own book. He gives him a vote of confidence and says, this is what you should study for tomorrow. Let's see how it goes. And slowly pulls him along. And like I said, we even see the baseball scene where you have Hundert getting involved in their lives in a perfectly appropriate way, as opposed to Keating not being that close to them when they're actually seizing the day. He doesn't hear about the kid going to the party and kissing the asleep girl. Like, so it's just I think that was a very interesting like dynamic where it seems like Keating would be more personally connected because of the ways that he is trying to inspire them, but he really actually isn't that involved outside of the classroom.
Do you think that's because Keating knows that he's doing sort of the wrong thing, that he's encouraging the wrong type of behavior, and that will get him in trouble?
Possibly. I think the other reason could be that he was obviously a rebel when he was in school and he wanted some free reign. So he probably thinks these students want that too.
So he just okay. So he more or less is treating them the way he would have wanted
That would be my guess.
teachers to treat him. But if you're a rebel, why would you even take clues from the teacher? Why would you even why would you seek the help of the teacher?
I can't say for sure because I was always the goody two shoes.
What I'm saying is, how is he helping them be rebels if they're basically in the sense of, like, in his mindset, he was a rebel. He was probably rebellious against all the teachers at the school back when he was there. I mean, maybe there was a teacher that also assisted him in being a rebel too, but I'm gonna guess not as much. So my point is, they're not really as rebellious because they're being supported by a teacher.
Yeah, and I think that what he's kind of doing is more just opening the door and showing them and then letting them choose, because he never told them to reestablish the Dead Poets Society. He was just kind of giving examples and then letting them run with it.
Okay, but he gave them everything they needed to make the Dead Poets Society, even like
Sure.
the introduction, like the piece of poetry that they did every time they started the Dead Poet Society session. Like,
yeah,
and
so I agree. I just think that from his mindset, he's not like leading them there. He's just inspiring them.
I just think he's delusional.
I'm not going to disagree there.
Yeah. I think this is this sort of idea that you're sort of a perspective that you're always being sort of persecuted, and that it's always not your fault, or you should never be chastised for it. So you see in other people sort of the same situation, even though it's completely different. But anyways, so I mean that's while, yeah, I mean, you could say that Keating is sort of driving them, but impersonally, even though he has a little bit of personal, sort of touch on it necessarily, while Hundert's trying to pull, his rebellious student back to safety, more or less. But both of them fail, at least with the main student that is the main character of both movies. Now, only one of them recognizes their part in the failure, that they did fail. I don't think that Keating's character ever realizes his mistakes.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So we don't have to go sequentially through it, but another one of the foil scenes I do think is, on the one hand, in Dead Poets Society, as Keating is packing up his stuff and leaving, not even all of the students, but the ones that were in the Dead Poets Society stand on their desks and say, "Oh, Captain, my Captain." On the other hand,
it wasn't just the members of the Dead Poets Society.
Well, it wasn't every student, though.
Yeah, I just want to point out that one of the students, who, it makes no sense for him to do this, because he has really, other than the actual class, like I'm like a sneezing guy, or whatever he had, he was always making noises with his nose because it was too stuffed up or whatever. Anyways, like, that didn't make any sense to me. He had no connection with the group.
Yep. But so that's the one scene where this is after Keating has ultimately led to a student committing suicide, and you have half the students in his class standing up, showing him support as he's being fired in shame. But
and they were basically almost begging the new teacher, who is, I believe, like the dean or something. He's
yep.
taken over to basically kick them out.
Yeah, pretty much. But I don't at that point, students are pretty emotionally traumatized after losing a student, so they'd probably show some leniency, especially since they signed saying it was Keating's fault. But I agree that it's anyways, the mirror scene in the Emperor's Club is when, after the breakfast that nobody was there for, that was supposed to be in Keating's honor,
Hundred.
Hundred. He goes back to his room, and all except for his rebellious student are there to celebrate him. And this, one of the big differences is the distance between the actual class and, the celebration of the teacher. These students that were 16, 17 years old, standing up on their desks, haven't had, other than, a student committing suicide, the opportunity to really live life and see how the lessons from, Keating actually played out. Whereas the students with Professor Hundert had years, decades, to see the ways in which they were affected by Hundert, and that his lessons actually did make an impact in their life. And that's why they not only, didn't show up to the breakfast and then surprised him in the room, they also had a really nice plaque that they made that's saying that he might not, or he didn't have conquests in life. Ultimately, he's kind of the opposite of Shutruk Nahunte, but he did have contribution because he helped to form so many students, and they've seen, in a good way, that play out over their lives, as opposed to something just happened, our teacher's getting fired, let's stand up and say he was great.
Yeah, definitely the contrast is very distinct. Now, what do you think about what that scene would look like for Keating in, like, if they had that type of scene for Dead Poets Society? What would it look like? What would the students be grateful to Keating 20 years down the line?
It's a very interesting question, especially given what the next decade is going to bring with the 60s.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
That what it kind of makes me think of is at the end of The Sandlot, when they're going over what happened to each of the guys, one of them was like, he got really into the 60s and was never heard from again. Like, that's kind of what I feel like may have happened with Keating students, is they probably would have gotten into the counterculture, and they may have even, that 20 years later, have appreciated, or, say that they appreciated Keating from breaking them free from those chains. But what's the ultimate state of their life at that point, as opposed to the other students from Hundert being, the movers and shakers of America?
Well, it's also it seems like, would the kids be boomers, basically? Would the students of Dead Poets Society be boomers?
Yeah.
Okay, and I believe the Emperor's Club kids would be Xers.
Yes.
Right. So the contrast between those two generations are also just very interesting. I mean, Gen X is basically more or less almost one of the left behind generations.
Yep.
And the boomers are the ones that are sort of holding on for dear life.
Yep.
Holding on to power for dear life. So do you see that in sort of the difference of approaches in this of the teachers?
Yeah, I'd say that ultimately they were both being countercultural to the culture that they were in. So Keating was taking the boomers and turning them into, proto hippies, basically. And Hundert, on the other hand, was taking, other than the one rebellious student, he was fighting the tide against the 70s and the 80s and making his students, almost more boomers than Xers in purely personality wise.
Well, do you mean? Well, no. Wouldn't it? I mean, I think they summed up Xers. Wouldn't it be that? I mean, the boomers were products of the type of education that Keating was personifying. Like, I don't think most of the boomers actually got like the exact education that the opposite of Keating would have taught, because this was very much like oozing into the education of the time period. This kind of school was, I believe, abnormal for the 50s.
Well, that's what I'm saying is I think that Keating made his students different from typical students in the 50s, and Hundert made his students different than typical students in the 70s.
I guess I just don't. My interpretation would have been that most regular schools in the 50s would not be like the one that the Dead Poets Society was at, right?
Yeah, completely fair.
So what I'm saying is that Keating actually might have been teaching more like a regular school in the 50s, because they were still holding to a lot of the traditions that are much older than sort of the 50s.
Yeah, that's true. That's a very fair point.
Because how do you go from, like, I mean, all the generation that like went crazy during the 60s was the generation that was in school in the 50s, right?
Yes and no, because it's also it was really started in 64 with the Summer of Love, and so the students would have been mid-20s by that, and I think that more so it was younger 20s and teens that were the ones really driving that hippie movement.
So younger boomers.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe. Yeah. Okay. Well, anyways,
it's all hypothetical anyways.
Yeah, I would have to do more research into actually like the education system of the 50s and the education of the 70s. Though this was abnormal for the 70s.
Absolutely.
100 education, very, very different. So that's definite. But I would say personifies sort of the way Gen X is not, is very different than the boomer generation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So anyways, anything else to pick out or to point out?
Yeah, another foil, I think, is the fathers of the main characters. Because in Dead Poets Society, you have the stereotypical overbearing father that, is determining what his son is and isn't going to do. He has his life mapped out for him. He can't do the yearbook. He can't do acting. He just has to listen and be an automaton. I'm not saying that that's actually what the father was, but that's how they were trying to portray him.
The standard WASP.
Yes, exactly. And on the other hand, in the Emperor's Club, the father is, first of all, I think it's interesting that the father in the Dead Poets Society, like, he's not a man that's at the height of his profession. Like, he's probably a mid-level manager somewhere. Like, it doesn't show him as being something, vitally important or big. and they had to scrape up enough money to give their son the chance to go beyond that. And on the other hand, in the Emperor's Club, the father figure is a senator and like clearly has money to throw around and is just completely uninterested in his son, even though he claims that he's going to be the one to mold his son. He never takes really any interest in him other than when he's in trouble or potentially going to win the Mr. Julius Caesar.
Yeah, he's more or less there for the sort of successes or for the failures. He's not there for any of the like important like molding moments, the important sort of basics of life.
Yeah. And it does have to be said that the father in the Emperor or in the Dead Poets Society was trying to do right by his son. He was saving the money and trying to give him new opportunities, and he was trying to help guide him because he was a teenager. And it was ultimately Keating that drove him off the deep end, not the father.
Well, Keating was subverting his father's basically authority.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. So even though in Dead Poets Society he's being shown as basically the villain that then ends up calling for Keating's removal, he was actually trying to do good by his son. Whereas you see the insidiousness of a bad teacher even from a good family.
Whereas, it's sort of the opposite. Like the main character father is sort of the complete opposite type of character than his roommate's parents. They don't even pay attention to their son. They buy him the same like desk set 2 years in a row. So you have sort of the extreme they have sort of the extremes on display, and what's really weird is that the roommate doesn't appreciate, the roommate could really, could have been there to be basically say to his friend that like you're kind of lucky that you actually have a father that cares.
Yeah.
Like he didn't have a father that cared at all. He didn't have any parent that even paid attention to him.
Yep.
So that kind of is an interesting thing. And he eventually and the roommate eventually at the end blames the father for the death of his son.
Yep.
So that's probably him blaming his parents more than anything else for his problems. And anything else, but just that the only reason, or like in the beginning, you don't really get like there's much of a conflict between father and son. It's until Keating gets involved.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that it's like looking at it from comparison again. On the one hand, even if from Dead Poets Society, even if you have a good family that you're raising, if they get the wrong influences and you aren't able to prevent that, it can lead to destruction. Whereas on the other hand, in the Emperor's Club, even if you have a great teacher and a great influence, if you haven't been raised right at home from the get-go, the teacher's really fighting against the tide and unlikely to make an impact with that child. So it's just showing that kind of what we mentioned at the beginning, the tendency towards evil, that you have to have a good, solid foundation from home, and the parents have to be involved enough to prevent evil influences like Keating, to make sure that their children are able to continue how they were raised.
Yeah. And you need to have you have to be raising them the right way as well. as
Yep.
you see from the Emperor's Club. That you can't and this is one of the things I think actually a lot of Gen Xers were what happened to them was many of them were raised by the school system than they were by their parents.
Yeah, and that's what you constantly hear when Gen Xers are complaining about millennials or Gen Z, that they they used to just go out in the morning and they had to be back before sunset, and like they basically had free reign of what they were doing outside of school. And these kids today have everything scheduled for them.
Yeah. Yes. Anyways, so yeah, any other comparisons?
No, I think that was the main areas that I wanted to touch on. The one thing I do want to like go back and again apologize for was the presence of, unfortunately, some scenes in the Emperor's Club that could have or would have been better without it being there. And that is the unfortunate part. Like every other piece of this movie I love, but it's really unfortunate that those two scenes were kept in the movie.
Yeah, I think it's a '90s problem.
Yeah.
Or sorry, no, a 2000s
It was
problem.
early 2000s.
Early 2000s problem. But it was but it's a 70s problem by virtue of the time period.
Yeah.
Like there wasn't that type of scene that could have been really shown in any context in the 50s.
Yeah, that's very true.
It wouldn't have made sense in Dead Poet Society.
Yeah.
Not that anybody nowadays is worried about making sense.
That's very true.
Accuracy, like nowadays, you wouldn't even be trying to go for any sense of accuracy. You could have whatever you want in a movie that's taking place in the 40s or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have sex scenes in Oppenheimer, all things.
Oh yes, yeah, exactly. Well, yeah. Anyways, but wasn't he a communist? Or a socialist?
Honestly, I don't have enough information about Oppenheimer, and I refused to watch the movie because I knew there were those scenes.
Anyways, the point is very much, I mean, those we're talking about like kids' experience of life versus an adult communist, probably, or a possible communist in the 40s.
Right, but I'm still just making the point,
Yeah.
all right, in general, that you were trying to make that it wouldn't make sense to have had those types of scenes in the 50s as much as it does in the 70s. It's still unfortunate that those scenes were there.
Completely agree. Well, I think I've said this previously, but I would say Dead Poet Society is a better movie. Emperor's Club has a better message. But I wish it was a better movie.
Yeah, I think that's fair. For me, I have always really connected with it, so it's still for me in my top 10 movies of all time list. But I know that it's not because of it being a good movie, but because it's such a good lesson. I would only recommend that people watch the Dead Poet Society to be able to like point out the errors and reject them. Like, especially if you're going to watch it with your kids, make sure you talk about it afterwards, because there's you can start to see the methods that evil teachers are going to be insidious with, and you can point that out to your kids and say, like, these are the things to watch out for. But ultimately, I would only watch Dead Poet Society as a cautionary tale.
Yeah. And I think you should do that type of mentality, talking about movies like that, like with almost every movie you watch.
Mm-hmm.
I think those types of discussions are things we need to have, especially if parents are going to show kids movies, or even just like amongst comrades, amongst friends, amongst gents. That needs to be done. Movie discussions.
Yeah, I have a friend out here that I mentioned before that we love. We go back and forth with who's going to be showing the movie, and we always intentionally pick what we're going to watch. Because we only do it at maybe every 2 months or so that we have a movie night. But we're showing our favorite movies so that we can discuss them, and what I love about it, and it's the same thing that I love with our conversations, Connor, is it's not just consuming media, it's digesting it. It's actually wrestling with, what is this trying to teach? Is that good or is that bad?
Yeah, exactly. So Mr. C says a new IRL battle of sending students to classical private schools, i.e. Chesterton Academy, versus normal private schools mimics secular AP curriculum with Christianity
Stapled in.
Stapled.
Or is supposed to, yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's honestly, the return to classical education has been gaining so much momentum over this last decade. It's been honestly really beautiful and inspiring to see. I have a friend who teaches at a Chesterton Academy, and I've just been able to hear stories from him about the students and the way that they're actually teaching, getting involved, reading the great books, not just, terrible textbooks that are so ubiquitous these days. But I'd also say that it's similar with the desire to homeschool, because it's so hard to know exactly what's happening in your student's classroom. The amount of stories of teachers complaining that parents were in the room during the pandemic as they had to do Zoom classes because they didn't want the parents listening in on the lessons is just insane. And in the 70s, I think there were less than 50,000 homeschooled students. And this year, there are over 5 million in the US. So I definitely fully support the return to classical education. And for those that aren't able to afford that, it's not around them, or they want to have a more direct hand in their child's formation, homeschooling is also a very viable option these days.
Yeah, I think we should just go back to having tutors.
Yeah.
Tutors for those who can afford it, and everyone else should just get the basics from their parents and then get a job.
Yeah, and obviously it's a difficult thing to do if you have to have both parents working, but that's another discussion for another day.
Well, if you have to get two parents working, are you doing it because, like, who's teaching the kids? Like,
yeah,
are you paying for that still? Like, what if you just, instead of two parents teaching, one of them's at home teaching the kids, and then you don't have to pay tuition for whatever?
Yeah, and like I said, I think that's another discussion we can have, but it's, for some people, it's just not in the cards for them, and I'm not going to try to reject that. I'm just very grateful that God has answered our prayers to make it so that my wife has been able to stay at home and homeschool. So I'm not going to make generalized statements at this point, just because I know there are people that it's just not possible for only one income.
I would say generalizing statements are perfectly valid as long as people accept the fact that there's always exceptions to the rules. So people just need to accept that just because someone said a generalized statement, they don't mean they're talking about you. So
yeah, that's fair.
I just think people have a problem where they, very me focused. It's all like what that person just said is all about me, even though they don't know who don't know who you are or whatever.
Yeah, that's fair.
I do think we'll get to the holdovers with Paul Giamatti at some
Giamatti.
point. So, Mr. C says Nolan never had nudity until Oppenheimer. Maybe it's the price for an Oscar. Yeah, it did not have to be rated R.
Yeah, it's very disappointing. One thing that we did, or I forgot to bring up the last time that I think is so weird, is that you can't stream The Emperor's Club anywhere.
What? Apple TV.
But you still, okay. So if you have Apple TV, then you can pay to rent it.
Yeah. Well, no. If you have Apple TV, you have it to stream.
Oh, okay.
I think you have to be subscribed to Apple TV. But
okay,
I think what you're saying more is that you can't rent on any streaming platform on like Amazon to watch it. Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's very weird for a movie that I think is, again, it's not really interesting from a cinematography perspective, but I really enjoy when there's so much garbage on all the other places. But if you wanted to watch it, apparently you can do Apple TV, or Connor actually bought a physical copy off of eBay.
Yeah, but it skipped.
Yeah.
It was not, it wasn't very good quality. And I double check before if you were to get Apple TV because of what I said, double check that it's on there, before you do that, because it may be still on there, it may not be, I don't know. That was a while ago that I checked. Xenex said both of the previous episodes in this trilogy I found very interesting. Excited to see the conversation topped off. God bless. Thank you, and I hope we did it justice today. So thank you for watching, and we really appreciate the comment. Jeff, anything to say before I go? I think it's wrap up time.
Yeah, I just say thank you again for having me on. I really enjoy these discussions. I'm excited for what we'll be dissecting in the future. I appreciate that anyone who listens to can deal with me droning on for as long as I do, but I really enjoy these discussions. And just again, as wrap up, only watch Dead Poets Society as a cautionary tale and make sure you break it down. And if you're going to watch The Emperor's Club, which I do recommend, try to look for the bad scenes beforehand and know when to skip. It's just 2 scenes in a row.
Yep. All right. Thank you, everyone. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And God bless. Bye.